Hi, Squamish. Good day, everyone. We're talking about economic reconciliation on the Indigenous Prosperity podcast today. I'm Christina Clark, Executive Director of the Indigenous Prosperity Center on Southern Vancouver Island. I'm joining you from Chianu First Nation Reserve Lands, where I'm an invited guest. I'm thankful to the Chianu people for welcoming tenants on these beautiful lands, and I'm happy to be a Chianu taxpayer. I also want to acknowledge and express gratitude that the Indigenous Prosperity Center and our sister organization, the South Island Prosperity Partnership, operates in the territories of 10 First Nations, including Chianu, Sauk, and Pachidat First Nations, the Lekwungen Nations Songhees and Esquimalt, and the Wasanik Nations, Sartlip, Sayout, Sycam, Pakwachin, and Malahat. Haichka, and thank you to the audience joining us live today. I hope you'll join the conversation. We'll open for questions about halfway through this hour. And Haichka also to the viewers who found this podcast after the broadcast and gave it a listen. We welcome you to this conversation. We're honored to welcome Sxwpilemaát Siyám as our guest today, and I invite you to turn your camera on. Haichka, thank you for joining us.
Siyám. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to be here today. Shall I jump in and start with a full introduction?
Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, listeners. Thank you to the hosts of this podcast today. My name is Sxwpilemaát Siyám, aka my given English name is Chief Leanne Joe. Sxwpilemaát is a name that I share with my late father, Sxwpilem Siyám, and all of the ancestors before me who also carried the name Sxwpilem. Sxwpilemaát, the at the end of my name, feminizes it, tells you that a woman is carrying that name. And it is synonymous with one who carries the responsibility of being the Siyam in Coast Salish spaces. That is one who has the responsibility of being the head of the family. In settler English language, you would say chief, but it is being the responsible head of the family. I'm responsible for the Lackett Joe family. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation, also known as the Squamish Nation. I'm a descendant of the Tsleil-Waututh community, our sister nation on the beautiful shores of North Vancouver. I hail from the Thomas family. On my late grandmother's side, on my father's side of the family. I am also a descendant of the Kwakwala speaking people on the east coast shores of Vancouver Island. My mom was born and raised in the settler community known as Comox. And she has belonged to the Comox First Nation before marrying my father and transferred to Squamish Nation. Makes me a true blue West Coast Indian. I'm literally related to pretty much everybody on the coast, not all, but a sizable amount of Indigenous individuals on the beautiful Coast Salish territories, which means I had to go to the Okanagan to find a husband that I wasn't related to, and vice versa. We live in his ancestral lands of the Inca Catlim and the Syilx-speaking people in the settler community known as Merritt, British Columbia. I am one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation. The Squamish Nation is an amalgamation of 16 communities, 16 families. It was power in numbers that our 16 hereditary chiefs at the time amalgamated to be the force that we are against the government. And not to break apart the territory way back in the day. We're actually coming up on our 100th anniversary this August of that amalgamation. And it's a beautiful place to be moving into. And my husband and I raised one amazing, beautiful human being, our son, Isaac, who is a young teenage man who is currently completing his rites of passage training from childhood into young manhood. So thank you for, again, letting me be here and sharing my kinship ties and my relation and place within the territories of Southern British Columbia. Siyám.
Thank you. And I note that this is something that we've done. I could have read a bio, but then the audience wouldn't have had the opportunity to hear from you what your connections are and where you come from. So this is a lesson and a learning for us too, and ways of ways of doing things. Sxwpilemaát Siyám is co-author with Lily Raphael of Step into the River, a framework for economic reconciliation for Simon Fraser University. I highly recommend this work as a foundation for all of us that are endeavoring to do the work of economic reconciliation. And I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to speak with you about this work today. We have some questions, and as I mentioned, we'll go into a Q&A, and I really do hope that our audience participates with us today. Very pleased to see mayors and council members from the region, and we've invited chiefs and council from the nations as well, and we have business leaders on the call. So thank you all for being with us today. The first question I have for you, Sxwpilemaát Siyám, is what brought you to this work? Why did you focus on economic reconciliation?
So much focus on reconciliation, and not that I'm not undervaluing the work of reconciliation as a whole, but wanted to highlight specifically the need for us to be like so many other voices out there, like Carol Ann Hilton and with the Indigenomics Institute, with again, so many Indigenous nationally led organizations. I won't name them all. And many of the leadership in this space over the years have talked about this, but I wanted to shed light on economic reconciliation specifically with the intentionality of being curious about what would it truly look like if it was embedded, again, a really holistic worldview about not just economic reconciliation, meaning that we just need a seat at the economic table, but what if we were to be curious about transforming an economic system, right? And how would that be different than what currently is? Because I personally believe that it's not working. You know, it's such an extractive, very colonial, capitalistic, like they're just, I mean, capitalism was created by white middle-aged men with no inclusivity or diversity of thought and of leadership of you know, there were, again, no diversity whatsoever. So I wanted to be curious. When we started this process, I started with the questioning of, you know, what would it be like, you know, to have a transformative economy? And how could we all work together to do that, right? Not an us and them approach, but again, a very holistic place. Because you see countries do it around the world with their well-being economies, right? And I wanted to take it even further than just that well-being place that is currently out there. Not that that's not a beautiful thing, but again, really, really curious about the diversity of knowledge and dissecting what is wealth, what do we value in that term, because it doesn't include all of the beautiful things which makes me wealthy. I am not wealthier because you or I have $1 more in our bank accounts. I am wealthy because I'm connected to land. I am wealthy because I carry the 2 ancestral names that I do. My son is wealthy because he carries 3 ancestral names, right? He's connected to community. He can go out hunting. He can go pick medicines. He can process those medicines. He can fish. He can walk the lands and know the sacred stories, the origin stories. There's just so much wealth in our ceremonies, in the governance of those ceremonies, all of the teachings. And again, I am wealthy because of those things. My late husband's, or my husband's late father always used to say, I don't need your money. We don't need your money because we already have everything that we need, right? So if you take that stance in looking at economic reconciliation, what then needs to shift, what needs to transform and change, and if better is possible, is good enough, right? So that's why I focused on this work.
Thank you. And in a sense, you've answered the next question, although we can talk further about it. Why is economic reconciliation important right now? And I've been thinking a lot about this myself. It's important because the the world needs it. The world needs a transformation. And as we're
Absolutely.
looking, yes.
Absolutely. Because again, if you're taking this a holistic worldview, you then have to be in reciprocity with all things that are within our sight, things that are not within our sight, right? We have to take our four body system. We have to take spirituality into account. We have to take the universe into account. We have to take all living things on this planet and the planet itself, and the four elements. And when you take all of those beautiful things into that reciprocity and knowing that we are completely interconnected, that the choices and decisions we make will consistently create ripples, right, and affect all things, which then again, be curious about, okay, if that's true, and I don't scientifically need to prove that it's true, because it is true. We all know that as human beings, we spiritually know this, is then how can we transform? What can we do differently? How do we do differently? And my framework is not prescribed. There are no tick boxes. It is a very non-prescribed framework. So one could ask, is it an actual framework? Well, and I'm framing curiosities is what I'm doing. I want you to be curious about your accountability and your responsibility, to the possibility of what could be, right? And that's good governance, right? That in and of itself is great leadership, right? And bringing in many voices and many spaces, and be uncomfortable, right, with what is not known to you, and also taking into consideration, so in the framework, the story that I tell is from a multi-generational approach. It also takes both past, present, and future into consideration as well. And I use the metaphor of ceremony throughout that whole entire space, because if I was actually to demonstrate what economic reconciliation is for me, we would be in ceremony. It wouldn't be a document that you're reading. You would bear witness to what it is for me, as a mother, as a Siyám, as an aunt, as a daughter, as a sister, as a future grandmother, right? As a land protector, as a water protector, right? And I hold many hats as an Indigenous woman. And that can only be shown through, again, a very sacred space. And again, the metaphor of ceremony is that sacredness. And how do we bring sacredness into space, right? And it's also demonstrating, again, a very unique worldview, right? And then my worldview is specifically Coast Salish, right? And that's why the beautiful co-author, Lily Raphael, provided a perspective of that way of being, knowing, and doing, and hopefully translating it into a space where many First Nations and many Canadians could see themselves in some way, and finding some grounding and landing space, so that they could, again, be very curious about what's possible in this space.
Yes, yes, thank you. And there's a quote in the framework: the economic sector cannot be exempt from truth telling. So I think we should talk about uncomfortable truths. What do people need to understand?
The truth is, this is, especially in particular British Columbia, we haven't signed treaties, right? Also, with those treaties that have been signed in the rest of Canada, we are literally, it's as simple as this: we are the first people of this land. Period. There was nobody here before us, right? Not human wise, right? And as the caretakers of that land. So, I mean, there's a beautiful quote of, we literally just borrow the land from our children, right? I don't own this land. I caretake it for the future generations. And it's my responsibility to do so. And So as the first peoples of this land, we are then therefore, in sovereignty with it, right? So therefore, every single settler that comes to this country has to understand that that relationship basically literally trumps everything else, right? From my perspective. And I think that would be the case and could potentially be said true for every Indigenous person in this country. We've had court cases galore. We've had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. There's been so many documents, so many reports that, we have had TRC calls to action. We have 231 calls to justice. We have the National Indigenous Economic Development Strategy. Like every corner where you turn in this country is specifically talking about reconciliation and economic reconciliation. Because again, we are the first peoples of this land. Our language is literally based on the land, right? So the interconnectedness of that reciprocity exists in the language. And who better to partner with, to work with, to collaborate with, to be in relationship with than your neighboring First Nation? Because who they are, their way of life, their choices, their governance is based in this knowing. So again, who better to be in relationship with and again, do better, create better possibilities. Again, if we're looking from, we have this current state, and let's be curious about a desired future state. And my call to action in this framework is to actually, don't look for me to the answers. I can't speak on behalf of any of the nations on the island. I can only speak for mine, right? So you have to go to your neighboring First Nation and build these relationships, and be curious about the possibilities about what they want to see for their territory, right? And at the end of the day, I've always shared, you're going to be in relationship with us, whether you like it or not, in some form or fashion. You can do it willingly, you can be forced into it, or as nations sign more treaties or sign specific agreements with the government of Canada, with the provinces, especially here in British Columbia, more self-government agreements are signed. The more economic development that continues to happen, because it's happening at an exorbitant fast rate, that again, you'll be employed, sued, or be in relationship in some form or fashion. There's no avoiding it anymore. So I say, let's quit siloing. Let's quit debating about whether this is important, because it just is. I don't need to sell you on that. No. That's not my job. My job is to be able to be curious with you, because what I want from my son and my unborn grandchildren is literally what I want for yours. It's as simple as that, right? And that's a beautiful starting place.
It's beautiful and powerful. And I've had people ask me before, why does everybody start with talking about TRC, UNDRIP, DRIPA? And the answer to that, I believe, is because the matter is settled that we need to do the work. It's been acknowledged. Took a long time for our governments to acknowledge it, but it's been acknowledged that we are doing this work. We've established why we're doing this work. So let's stop arguing about whether we need to do the work or not. And that's wasting time. We've got to get to the work. And the work is beautiful, as you just described. The learning together, the creating the Canada that we could have started in the beginning. And I guess the uncomfortable truth for everybody is we messed up as a country really, really badly. Great harm was done. So correcting this, I look through a restorative justice lens in a sense. It's not just forgive and forget and move on. It's acknowledge, understand, rectify, change, learn, grow, redress. There is redress required here because of the harms that were done. So
Because healing is absolutely required in this space, right? It's not separate. Reconciliation and healing doesn't belong over here, and economic reconciliation isn't here. It's all healing needs to happen in every single space when we're talking about reconciliation, right? We can't. I guess again, that's another reason I focused on economic reconciliation, is bringing to light that through all of this is, again, not only the uncomfortableness of the truth, but also the healing required in the dismantling of literally everything through, again, this intensely extractive economic state that we have created and continue to perpetuate. And our children are literally crying and begging for something different. And we, as their parents, as their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents, as their godmothers, godfathers, right? Literally, it is our responsibility to do something different, right? Because we have to be listening to them, and we have to take it to our heart that, again, if we don't do this, then what legacy are we leaving? Because the greatest legacy for me is my child's well-being. His future is based on the decisions that I make for his future, for his cousin's future, for your children's future, right? I'm again, my way of being as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous woman, has been to caretake, to be in service, and to think, again, holistically, to be able to see everything. And through that, again, is this call to action that can be, that worldview can be brought into so many different spaces to allow for this transformative space to take place from our current state to a desired future state.
yes. Yes. Can you, I think we should talk a bit about the stepping stones that you've offered to help us navigate the river of our collective reconciliation journey. What are these stepping stones?
I'll quickly share my screen if that's okay.
Thank you.
And I'll bring up this image for everybody. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Okay, great. So this is the foundation of the river and the foundation of the framework. So step into the river and economic reconciliation framework. The riverbed holds the transformative values of economic reconciliation. Values are important in everything that we do. It's in ceremony and who we are. So the stepping stones, which are in the corner there, which is self-reflection and awareness, relationship building, questioning, learning, unlearning, and active deep listening, are the different spaces in which you're going to be stepping on. You're going to be walking through and by and on. You're going to hold up these practices to support to stay in the flow of the river. These values are literally everything that this framework is built upon. It's everything that I stand for. It's how I choose to live my life. The ones that are really important value-wise for me is rematrician, upholding Indigenous women in every single space is the foundation in which economic reconciliation is truly going to be built. And of course, there's other spaces like accountability and truth-telling that need to be at the forefront, but none of these are weighted more or less than each other. They go hand in hand. The stepping stones, again, are places to be able to say, self-reflection and awareness literally is hold up a mirror, right? It's holding up a mirror and saying, and being curious about, am I holding these values, right? Am I being curious? And it's just a lot of curiosities about what's working, what's not working. Where do you need to deepen your practices? Where How would you uplift more of these values in the work that you're doing? Do these reflect the relationship you have with your neighboring First Nation communities? And then, you go into the relationship building. So do I have a relationship with my neighboring First Nation? If not, why not? Right? And then where do you go from there? How do I, and I always tell this in a lot of my lunch and learns and presentations is, again, connect with your neighboring First Nation or First Nations, your urban Indigenous individuals, the Métis communities, everybody that you're going to be in relationship there with, and assume you know nothing and ask them to lead. It's as simple as that. It doesn't need to be any harder than that. Let them lead in this space. What do they want? Where are the opportunities? Where do you need to begin? What healing needs to take place? What truth telling needs to take place? What do you need to learn from each other? What do you need to unlearn? Right? There's, again, just, it's a beautiful space to be able to grow and create a trusting reciprocal relationship based on valuing all of these things, but valuing the relationship as much as you do each other. And then moving into the questioning and unlearning, and unlearning is just as important as the learning part, right? Because you're learning to dismantle a very colonial mindset and dismantling a very capitalistic worldview that is very extractive. You're being curious and questioning about your practices, your protocols, your policies, right? How you are in relationship with each other, because, don't ever assume that you know what type of relationship a First Nation wants, right? Again, assume you know nothing going in and allow them to lead. And all of this requires deep, active listening. You need to be able to, again, remove how you think things need to be done, right? Remove tons of assumptions. And this is, again, going to be uncomfortable because not everybody wants to fit into the square box, and nor should we ever force anybody into a certain box. We have to be able to look at all shapes, all sizes, all spaces as beautiful places of learning, being, and doing. And I guess that sums it up in a nutshell. I go into it much more deeper into the framework, but that's in a nutshell.
Yes, and again, I recommend that folks go to Simon Fraser University online, and you can find this document. And there are definitions. It's really full of great information. And when I think about unlearning, that's what creates the space for new understanding. We have to clear away old ways of thinking that we were just, many of us were raised to just assume that's the way things are. If we could move the needle on one commonly held misconception, what would you wish for our audience to unlearn?
That there is that one way isn't always the way. Right? There's multiple ways of getting to where we need to be. There's multiple worldviews, and valuing the first peoples of this land's worldview is literally was what's going to save us. Because without,
you talk about this like two-eyed seeing. The
absolutely. Because I don't want to discount. I mean, I'm not saying that all non-Indigenous people are wrong, or that science is wrong, or all of this. No, I'm literally saying we have never valued Indigenous people, right? Or else we wouldn't be here, right? That's just the truth. The government currently, we're still governed by an Indian Act under this under the country. It is in the Constitution. The Indian Act still exists, right? Which means somebody has the right to veto my membership, decisions that we make, how we vote, yada, yada, yada. And they've created like a gazillion different acts to help potentially alleviate some of that oppression, but it continues to just perpetuate colonization, that oppressive thinking, a non-Indigenous worldview. So this, again, this is why I've created, I mean, I'm nothing, that needle with the government and Crown Indigenous relation shifts ever so slightly, in very little ways. And until that significantly changes, where are the other spaces where we can do more? And I think in this economic space, we can do a lot more, right? Just because we have so much more freedoms to be able to create partnerships, collaboratives, and really get this two-eyed seeing is about understanding that my goals, our goals, are not much different than yours, i.e. being corporate Canada, being Canadian citizens. Again, my son's well-being is just as important as yours, as your children's, as your grandchildren's. Therefore, why aren't we working together, right? How can we use this two-eyed seeing? How can we use the beautifulness of our knowledge as well as yours and come up with a beautiful, new, again, desired future state, where we can proudly, absolutely turn to our children and say, we're trying, we're working at it, we're shifting and transforming because you've asked us to. And that shows great leadership on our part, to mentor them into what is possible, because they have ideas for things that are potentially out of our mind and out of our heart, because their creativity is going to be fueled by ours. So again, the footsteps of this journey are just as important, not only for us, but again, for 7 generations from now.
Yes. Are you seeing meaningful relationships produce real results?
Yeah, as much as like anything else, like, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we're humans, right? And I'm a very spiritual person. My hope, you know, my husband, my son, we're very spiritual people. And my belief and our beliefs are, you know, I'm a spiritual person having a very human experience. I have specifically chosen to be a human being in this particular life. And through that journey, you know, we are never, ever going to please 100%. You know, not everybody's going to be on the same page all the time. There are varying versions to every single story. That's the beauty of storytelling, is everybody has a different version of it and carries different versions of it when it passes it on based on your lived experience. But again, that doesn't mean that it can't be meaningful and beautiful. But yes, I see more and more all the time, beautiful relationships being built, great economic transformative spaces, collaborations, that sort of thing. That is constantly in movement and is happening more and more. But there's also, you know, cities, municipalities that refuse to do a land acknowledgement, right? You know, so that spectrum is quite large, right? So I don't want to say it's all beautiful sunshine and rainbows, because it isn't. Reconciliation is very difficult work. It's very challenging work. And it's not going to come without its bumps and its bruises. And but if we continue to be, again, identifying that's why values are so important, right? And identifying what that is in building the relationships, because without those, you can go awry and things can get very muddled in that space. But if you get down to the core of everything, and can I share one more thing while I'm talking about this? I'm going to just pull it up again. I'm going to share this with everybody so that they can also see it.
In the meantime, I encourage our audience members to type in questions. We've got one lovely comment, which I'll read in a moment, but please do Add your questions. I remember this slide from your presentation.
Yes. So if our commonality, if we can find a simple space, and I wanted to transform how I saw wealth and what I wanted wealth to be in a visual format. I'm a kinesthetic learner, right? The written word can be very challenging to translate from, because what language I speak in my heart, I may not be able to speak it to you, publicly in my own mother language or languages, but it's in my heart, it's in my DNA, right? And I wanted to be able to translate that. And my call again to action in this learning and unlearning in this two-eyed seeing space of this reconciliation framework is, what if we were to literally center children and families, but more specifically our children, in everything that we do, which then really influences all of the spaces of wealth creation. If we're constantly centering them in our decision making and our policies and our practices and the values, literally everything, which then also influences, because it ripples out, it then shifts and transforms the potential of how we manage that wealth. So the wealth creation is in all of these things. These aren't all of them. This is the highlights, the highlight reel of what can go in this community wealth ripple. But then again, the ripple out to wealth distribution. And what does that look like? And again, this is being just curious about the possibilities, because this is the common ground, right? I'm always going to go back to this common ground of our goals aren't that different. Yes, I'm not saying that money isn't important. Our economic system literally, is built on these transactional spaces. But again, can we be curious about the possibility of valuing and centering something different than what we currently do? And then again, rippling out from there, how can we look at what then wealth creation, wealth management, and wealth distribution looks like in our relationships, in the relationships in our families, in the relationships in our communities, in the relationships in the economic world, right? Because it then allows us to potentially think very differently about the possibility of what is, what could be, and where we could be.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There's a comment in the questions that says, wow, your message needs to be continuously delivered to all our children through the school systems, starting right from daycare through all levels of education. I've always believed all aspects of reconciliation can only be achieved through education and awareness. That's Gail Scott from the District of Soup. Thank you. There's a question from the Chamber. Would it be the Chamber of Commerce here, the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce? Would it be respectful protocol for non-Indigenous organizations or individuals to lobby governments to reform or repeal the Indian Act? What are your thoughts on that?
You would have to do it in relationship with First Nations, right? I'm not saying no, absolutely. But if you are not informed about what the Indigenous people want themselves and how they want it, and again, that's going to vary. We have 204 First Nation communities in this province alone. That's a lot of different thoughts, leadership, opinions, ideas about, say the abolishment of the Indian Act, or again, a lot of different spaces. So in order to do that, you have to be in right relationship with both political organizations and both neighboring nations as well, because you want to be able to support and be in true allyship in that space with them.
Yeah, and it's very challenging because nations have learned how to operate within the Indian Act. So it's a known evil. We
Absolutely
know how to operate in it. So what is it going to be replaced with, and how are we going to, replicate some of the solutions that people have used to get around the challenges in the Indian Act?
Because that's a very wicked problem. It's not as simple as saying we just need to abolish the Indian Act. There's so many questions that need to be addressed before that can actually happen, right? It is a very wicked problem.
It really is, because it's so entrenched.
Absolutely.
There's another question here from Diane Simpson. Regarding land acknowledgements, there is comments that reflect the land acknowledgements have become rote. What can we, how can we develop words and ways of developing things so that it's more meaningful? How can we keep land acknowledgements meaningful?
Again, in the development of your land acknowledgement, have you done that again in relationship with your neighboring nations, right? And those whose territory you live, work, and play. That's an important piece. And not every nation is going to want to say, hey, I have the time, effort, or energy for that. But you are going to find a champion within every single community to be able to say, this is how it's meaningful. This is where we need to step it up. But land acknowledgements are literally just like sprinkles on the cupcake, right? Reconciliation is literally the foundation of the cupcake hasn't changed. We're just sprinkling stuff on, right? And where land acknowledgements, become just another sprinkle, is through your actions beyond land acknowledgements. That's the most important piece, is what happens beyond the land acknowledgement, right? That's true allyship, right? Is doing the land acknowledgement and honoring those Indigenous territories and the language and the peoples that are the first peoples of that. Where then are you actually doing something to transform colonization, to lift oppression, to break down barriers, to be in relationship with those nations, to create economic partnerships? Where is the action after? That's where and why they become alive, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, it can't just be a land acknowledgement and think, okay, we've checked that box. I mean, that's it's very important for us to not check boxes in this work, because
Right.
you can take all the same steps another organization took, but if you do it without the deep work of self-reflection, of building relationships, then you won't achieve anything other than we did these steps. But without the commitment to really questioning how we think.
And that's where, and I want to add, and that's where the stepping stone piece is so important, is really looking at, if you go into the framework and you really look at and be curious about, because I break it down into some very specific sectors, like, in the framework, talks about what under finance and financial management and, that sector, what can it be curious about? What can it change? How does placemaking shift and transform? Again, there's so many beautiful, amazing spaces to have impact, in procurement, in supporting entrepreneurship, in rematriation. Again, there's just so many beautiful spaces for every single individual in this country and every single entity, no matter whether you're for profit or you're, on the TSX or you're a mom and pop shop. There are spaces to be in action.
There are, and the two things. I want to talk about rematriation before we're done, but for Bob Patrice's question here, where can people reach you if they want to invite you to speak? How do people find you? What's the best way for people to find you, to ask you to do more of this work?
So if you go to Simon Fraser University Community Economic Development, under the Community Economic Development page is this economic reconciliation space. This is where you're going to download the document. But how to cite this document is there. Tons of storytelling is there. My email is there. Feel free. Do not be shy. Drop me an email. Let's connect. I have done presentations for literally almost every sector so far, and happy to connect about sharing what I've just shared with you. And I do have a good hour-long presentation that I can do in any space, both in person and virtually, because I've done them both. So again, don't be shy, ask questions, be curious. And if you're looking to do more of this deeper work, a lot of the work that I'm doing now is within my own consulting company as well, right? My hat within this space, within SFU specifically, is one of many that I wear in the work that I do as well. So,
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, I wanted to make sure that we talked about rematriation. We witnessed in our region here repatriation of a Nooksack pole by the Royal BC Museum recently, and you've used the word rematriation and gave us a definition of it earlier. But can you talk a little bit more about rematriation, what it is, and the importance of it?
literally, just holding up Indigenous women everywhere, all the time, creating space for them to see themselves reflected in space, to allow them to have voice, to give them space to share that voice, to honor their responsibilities as matriarchs in their communities, electing them as leaders, putting them on your boards, putting them in C-suite positions and executive management positions, creating mentorship programs, creating daycares, providing employment, education, skills development, training, supporting entrepreneurship for Indigenous women. Literally every space there should be an allowance to ensure one Indigenous woman or more is in that space, right? Be cognizant of the cultural safety, the cultural humility that is needed in creating that space for them. They are the most oppressed. We would not have 231 calls to justice if there was that kind of safety in this country. Right? I can't state that enough. There is the importance of that cultural safety, that cultural humility, the understanding. I wrote a beautiful document with the Women in Leadership Foundation. If you go to the Women in Leadership Foundation website and you go to the Indigenous Leadership Circle page, it was a project that I led with some monies from the federal government. The report itself literally talks about exactly what I'm sharing, right? About the rematriation piece in corporate Canada. But it's not just in corporate Canada that it's needed. We need it in our own communities, and provide the spaces for healing for them. This, again, just literally everything. We have to be upholding Indigenous women, and just be curious. Be curious what that is. How can I do this in my space? How can I do it personally? How can I do it professionally? And be curious about how you dismantle and decolonize to be able to create that cultural safety and that cultural humility, to learn and unlearn. Again, this isn't easy work. I'm not here to say if you go and create an entrepreneurship program for Indigenous women, just because you create it doesn't mean that they're going to show up. That's not a solution. The solution is really looking deep into what are you perpetuating, what needs to shift, what needs to transform. And again, be curious with Indigenous women. Ask them, what do you need? What do you want? Right? Don't assume that you know, and don't take my word for it. Speak to the women who you want to provide programs and services for, or that training for, or that entrepreneurial program for. There's tons of spaces to support Indigenous women-led businesses. Tons. There's tons. It's the fastest growing entrepreneurial space in this country is with Indigenous women. How are you supporting them? Where can you purchase products, right? Where can you purchase their services? Where do you purchase their training? Because guaranteed you will find an indigenous woman in this country that offers what you're looking for.
Wonderful. And we're launching a South Island Indigenous business directory very soon here in our region, and that will be one place that people can go and find female entrepreneurs. Yeah, I have a very practical question for you, and I know because I worked for 27 years with Squamish Nation, and really we were overburdened with attempts to do work, to do reconciliation work, to do consultation work. When a group is trying to do this work and reaches out to the local First Nation, and that if that nation just doesn't have time for them, which I certainly get, I didn't have time for all the people trying to engage with Songhees. What should people do then? What do you do in the absence of the when you're waiting for the community to have the time or to have the desire to do that work? Or is there some way, I used to say if there was an army of Indigenous engagement officers in the nations that could work with all of the engagement officers that are coming to meet with them. What's your advice in this area?
Don't ever take the lack of communication or lack of engagement on behalf of a nation, that silence, as an unwillingness. Generally, it's a lack of capacity, meaning there's not enough human resources in the community. Because unlike municipalities, we are federal government, we are provincial government, we're a municipality, we're the TNRD or the regional districts, we're all of these things. We manage our own health, we manage our own social services, we handle economic development, we're handling infrastructure, right? There's copious amounts that are going on in each of our nations. And we're scrambling for resources to manage all of these things. We have referrals coming in, sometimes by the dozens and hundreds per day, right, in our communities for various things. So don't take the that silence or the lack of communication as an unwillingness. It's not. It's just for the fact that, again, it's where are those resources going to and their priorities. And the priority, of course, is consistently the community members and the programs and services and everything else that's going on to uplift the nation. My recommendation, if there was, an army of engagement officers, if you want to dismantle the Indian Act, get ISK to fund that. Get a regional district to fund that, right? Municipality can fund that, right? There's funding out there to be creative, to create this relationship, again, this reciprocal relationship with these nations, right? So think outside of the box. How can I be creative to help a nation or nations or a tribal council, create this allyship and have this position so that they are solely navigating that engagement space? Why is it solely left up to the nation to figure that out? Right? It can be, we can do this in collaboration. And again, it's just being curious about the possibilities.
And I think one thing too that people can do is do as much research as you can. The nations have published a lot of information. There's strategic plans, comprehensive plans online, websites. Do that research beforehand, so you're saving that community.
Absolutely.
To tell you again
Absolutely.
what they've already stated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely. And try to align. If you try to align where you're trying to engage with what the nations are, if they have a strategic plan, it says this is what they're interested in. You say, I see you have an interest in this. Here's an area we'd love to collaborate with you, and we'll fund a position. We'll fund the position for somebody to work with us.
Exactly. I mean, again, that has to be built into. Again, this is where this learning and unlearning and intentionality and, again, educate yourself, arm yourself with all of as much information as you can, find that alignment. And again, think outside of the box about the possibilities.
Yes, and as we really learned today, it's not so much the specific actions you take. it's how you take them. It's how you do the work, how you carry yourself, what happens internally while you do this work, and what you put into the relationship building. And when we do that, we build the relationships, then the to-dos will come out of that. Together we'll decide what we want to do together.
Absolutely. Because the last thing I'll close with the last thing any nation or any person wants is, hey, I have this great idea. I know what's best for us moving forward. That's the last thing any community or any person wants. You got to go in again with such intentionality of, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, I want to know what the collaboration is going to look like. What do you need? What support do you need? Everything, right? Like, again, this is a two-way street. Because the more we understand that if we're, again, valuing the centering of our children, we're not taking an us and them approach. We're not stealing business away from you, right? Our intentionality is the well-being of the next generations. And therefore, what are we valuing, and how do we do that again in a beautiful way together?
And if we get this right, we could be world leaders for climate action. We could transform our society.
Absolutely, because everything that stems from literally what I've shared in the framework will again bring about all of the intentionality of climate action, climate justice, sustainability. Just so much can be brought in. We just have to lay this beautiful foundation first, right? And then from there, we can then start, really getting into the deeper spaces of what's possible, because you are going to be pleasantly surprised and really taken back by the beauty of the knowledge and the caring and the intentionality of our ways of being, doing, and knowing into every single space, and how it can provide, again, the foundation in which we build all of the potential solutions for the crisis that we're currently in.
Yes. Thank you so much. We've reached the 12 o'clock, reached the hour here. That went by fast. I really appreciate everyone for joining us today. And I really appreciate you, Sxwpilemaát Siyám, for your work in this area, for your generosity in sharing with us, your open-heartedness that you approach this work. And I will continue to learn from you, and I thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.